Good morning, everybody. First of all, thank you very much, Jodie, for your very generous welcome to country. It is a real pleasure to be back on this land, and I used to live and work in Wollongong, and it's also a great pleasure to be welcomed back onto the land. And I acknowledge the Aboriginal elders, past and present, and any Indigenous people here. I also acknowledge the Indigenous people of the Bespoke Nation, on whose land I now live and work, and acknowledge also that their sovereignty of this land has never been ceded. Thank you also to my lovely former colleagues and friends at the University of Wollongong who've organised this conference and have invited me to speak. It's kind of a bit weird being back in 67-107, one of my old stomping grounds. I used to lecture in here twice a week, so I'm quite familiar with this lecture theatre. But it's fantastic to be here to speak with you about some of the ideas that I've been working with over the last 6 or 7 years. And I'm very much, this is a very practical idea, and it's kind of coming from my point of view and my position as a teaching academic, and now as somebody who leads on governance and strategy and sort of initiatives, innovative initiatives at a university in Australia at a faculty level. So I'm very much coming at it from that direction. I'm very keen to hear what your thoughts in terms of coming at it from your direction. Because one of the critical problems that I see at the moment, that a lot of the teaching and learning that goes on in universities is very siloed away from some of the learning support services that are also available to students, particularly in language and learning, but also in terms of information literacy and other things to do with careers and employment. That T has sort of fallen off the end, sorry. This is what often happens when you go from a Mac to a PC. And I know that a lot of my colleagues are very keen, and I think a lot of you are very keen, to see it look a little bit more like this, where we're all feeling like we're all working together. I feel that as we're moving into the future, there's a real sense that it takes a village to put together the sorts of learning experiences that students need. And we need to be thinking about how we might work together more effectively. And I know that we've always got a bit of a problem with silos at universities, particularly big universities like UNSW where I work. And the way that a lot of learning, language, library instruction happens is we have a bit of a tendency to wheel people in at the beginning of semester, often in O week, and then wheel them back out again, and then wheel the students in to a workshop that's scheduled perhaps in week 4, and then wheel them back out again. And it feels very sort of wheeling in, wheeling out. There's also a bit of a passing on. There's a bit of a tendency to say to students, academics to say to students, go to the learning centre. You have a problem with your writing, or you have a problem with your understanding, go to the learning centre. Sort of a bit of a passing of students hand to hand. And then, of course, students self-selecting the sort of support that they need. But I hear from colleagues in the learning centre a bit of a frustration when they've got a half-an-hour session with a student who sits down and said, I need help with my writing. And by the time they've figured out what the problem actually is or what the support is needed, the half an hour has gone. Now, we all know that embedding this is the goal. That's what we're all after. You know a lot more about this than I do. It's an area that you're obviously much more invested in, much more engaged with than I am. But it's something I'm very, very passionate about. And I've done a lot of team teaching with academic skills tutors, as they're called in the UK. I've worked in the UK for 8 years. Doing that sort of team teaching, embedding the sorts of language learning and information literacy into the teaching that I deliver. But what I'm hoping to share with you today is perhaps a new set of tools in our armoury that we might be able to use to get some more of this embedding going more widely across the curriculum and actually make it sort of more of our standard practice, more of what everybody does in a very routine way. And what I'm talking about here comes from learning analytics, and I think this is a really fantastic quote that really reminds us why I think learning analytics is going to be important. Campbell and Oblinger say, in higher education, many institutional decisions are too important to be based only on intuition, anecdote, or presumption. Critical decisions require facts and the testing of possible solutions. And to my mind, that's a sort of mantra for me in terms of thinking about learning analytics. What might we be doing to inform the sorts of decision making that we need? But I want to explain what I take learning analytics to mean. It's one of those sort of slippery terms that can mean lots of different things to lots of different people. And I would argue that it nests inside a bigger idea, which I would call academic analytics, which more or less is a euphemism for business intelligence in higher education. We don't like talking about things like business intelligence in education sectors because we don't like to think of ourselves as a business. So academic analytics has sort of become a euphemism for that. It's something that most institutions have been doing for quite a while now. It's really, analysing things to do with student attrition, things to do with student destinations and so forth. But learning analytics, to my mind, sits nested within that, and it's using data to make informed decisions regarding student learning. So it's specifically looking at how we might use data to better understand what is benefiting students and what might be holding them back, what might be barriers to their learning. Now, I'm introducing another idea into this, and I've coined this term assessment analytics, and that's a subset again of learning analytics, and it's specifically looking at the analysis of assessment data within a learning analytics strategy. Now, one of the things that struck me when I was first doing research on learning analytics was the absolute deafening silence on assessment. You read paper after paper, you read all of the SOLAR papers, the LAC papers, and almost nobody talks about assessment and feedback. And that really struck me as odd, because to my mind, assessment should be really central to what we're doing in a learning analytics strategy. All students are assessed and all tutors mark student work. It's something that everybody in an education context does. And I think the ubiquity of it is what's so critical. A lot of other learning analytics is focused only on subsets of students or subsets of student behaviour, whereas for assessment, it is ubiquitous, it is routine, and it is normative. It's something that everybody widely understands, it's something that is expected, and everybody who's involved in it, both tutors and students, gets it. But I think the most critical part of all of this, it's also important. It's considered to be important by everybody who's involved with it. It's what students pay for, and I think there's very interesting stuff by Magdalena Tarras that talks about, in a fee-paying culture, students see their assessment results as their return on their investment. It's a kind of very interesting paper, and I would commend her work to you. But also, people like Royce Sadler and Chris Rust argue that it's actually that academic judgment that is brought to bear on student work when marking assessment is ultimately one of the key things that academic staff are paid to do. But the other reason why I like the idea of assessment analytics is it's focused very much on achievement or attainment, not just on retention. And there's a lot of focus in learning analytics, because so much of it comes out of the United States and Northern America in particular, where attrition is such a huge problem, that there is this big focus on retention, which is again just a subset of students. But this is why I think we've never really thought about doing assessment analytics before, and why it's such a blind spot in the learning analytics research. And that's because the data sets that we've had available to us prior to the sort of beginnings of e-marking haven't been fine-grained enough. So we've collected data on, say, degree classification, GPA or WAM at progression, course results, and assessment task results. So we know, for instance, in the UK sector, whether a student got a first-class degree or a 2-1 degree. Those classifications aren't quite so common in Australia, but we have similar kinds of degrees with distinction or degrees with excellence. We also get a sense of an end-of-year GPA or WAM, so what a student's average is at that point. We know that, say, for Arts 1111, a student got 72 and another student got 74, so we know that data as well. And we know that the numbers that make up that 72 or that 74 might be 63 here and 85 there. But the problem is that one student getting a mark like 72 might have been achieved for a very different reason for another student getting a mark of 72. So it doesn't really tell us a great deal. Now, with the advent of e-marking, and quick show of hands, how many of you feel that a significant proportion of academic staff responsible for marking at your institution are now e-marking? Yeah, it doesn't surprise me. It's probably about half. I think there's a real move towards it now. But because of that, we're now gathering more data, we're gathering more information. We're often using rubrics in some kind of marking schema that basically can be used as a way of collecting how well students are performing or achieving against a set of assessment criteria. But we're also collecting information about the kind of inline comments that tutors are putting down on student work. Now, the tool that I've used most to work on these ideas has been Turnitin's GradeMark. Anybody familiar with the use of Turnitin for marking purposes? GradeMark? Yeah. But there are lots of other tools. Anybody familiar with Review, for instance? Yeah, it's not quite so widely used, but it's well loved by the people who use it. There are lots of other tools that can work as well, but for the purposes of what I'm talking about here, I'll be using the sort of discourse of GradeMark. Basically, the rubric tool that is used within GradeMark can help us harvest information about student performance against assessment criteria, and the quick marks can help us harvest information about strengths and weaknesses or areas for improvement or problems or errors that students are demonstrating in their behaviour in their assessment. Now, previously, we've always laid these data sets down. We've always recorded this information. It's just we've done it in pen on paper and then we've given it back to the students. Now we're using these systems. We're actually able to collate this data, harvest this data, mine it, analyse it, and then do something with it, which takes me back to that quotation about making informed decisions. And what I want to do now is take you through my own personal journey of where I started with this, because really it was kind of I sort of stumbled across this data and looked at it and thought, well, what could I do with this? And as an individual academic teaching staff member, and I remind you I was working in the UK and I had a huge class size. I mean, my colleagues used to look at me and say, how on earth do you possibly manage 120 students a year? They used to fall off their chairs with exhaustion, and I think, wow, no idea. But anyway, I don't know about you, but there's classes at UNSW with 2,000 students on them. Is that sort of pretty standard? Yeah. They used to think 120, you must be exhausted. How do you do it, Cath? Anyway, so I was doing it all on my own, but I was getting a good data set out of it. And I was interested in both what it could tell me about my teaching practice, and what information it could tell me about the effect of interventions that I was making and changes that I was making in my own curriculum design. But also I started to think, what effect might this have if I showed it to the students? What benefits might it bring them? So to start with, I want to sort of just show you where I very first started with this, which was my self-evaluation. And this is just a very, very simple example of some of the information that I was able to harvest. So basically up the left-hand side, there's the rubric criteria, the assessment criteria, 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5 going up the left. And then across the bottom was the proportion or the percentage of students that achieved a first, a 2-1, a 2-2, a third or a fail against that assessment criteria. Again, this is the UK sector. You can translate that into HDD, credit, pass, fail, or 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, depending on what the marking scheme is. And so I was actually able to see what proportion of students were doing well on particular assessment criteria, where most students were struggling, where most students were failing. And so, it was sort of interesting. I sort of knew this. I had a kind of gut instinct that this is how the students were doing, but was actually able to see it. But actually what I then did was I compared the previous year to that year. And you'll notice that for most of these criteria, they're pretty stable. But look at the difference in criteria 3. So in the previous year, I'd looked at this data and I'd said, right, that's obviously where most of the students are struggling the most. I need to do something about that. And so I actually changed the way that I approached teaching that particular aspect. I can't quite remember what it was, but I did change it. And then was able to look at it the following year. And I could see quite clearly that that had had a positive impact, that fewer students were struggling with it, that that had moved the criteria across to closer to where all of the others were. So that's just a really quick and easy example. You can see this dates back to the academic year of 2009-2010. So that's where I sort of started my journey. But then I was thinking, well, what if I show some of this information to the students? And so this is where I started to really be inspired by my colleague and PhD student, Pat Hill. I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with her work. She was, and again this is the British terminology, she was the academic skills tutor in my school at the University of Huddersfield, but she was also my PhD student. And she did a fascinating PhD on writing, on writing and language. And I really like this quote from her. She said, more openness in dealing with writing as a social system where visible writing differences are used to discriminate, and acknowledgement of the complexity that students face in minimising these differences. That's what she's arguing. We need that kind of awareness that this is a complex problem that students face. And it really, working with her during her PhD really made me realise that the way I'd been approaching marking up until that point was doing no good at all to anybody. I was just pointing out errors to the students and getting frustrated with them when they didn't fix them quickly and easily. She was able to show me, and I learned through her, just how complex all of this was for students who were struggling with particular aspects to do with language. And I was also inspired by the work of Royce Sadler, and about what he told me and David Bowd told me about my approach to feedback. Royce Sadler talks about information about the gap between actual and reference levels is considered as feedback only when it is used to alter the gap. And that's when I started to be thinking about, well, how do we close that gap between the actual and the reference level? In other words, what the student is actually demonstrating or behaving, how they're behaving in their assessment, and where we want them to be in terms of an ideal reference point. And David Bowd picks this up and he says, the only way to tell if learning results from feedback is for students to make some kind of response to complete the feedback loop. And this is when it sort of dawned on me that what we often refer to as feedback isn't feedback at all. Wouldn't you agree that a lot of people, a lot of academics in particular, say that I've given you feedback, and what they mean is I wrote something at the end of your assessment and gave it back to you. It's not feedback, it's information. It only becomes feedback when the student acts on it. And David Bowd has this wonderful diagram in some of his presentations of an electrical circuit. Any electrical engineers here? Good, okay, because I don't know much about this. But in electrical engineering, a feedback loop doesn't happen until the feedback loop is closed, until something has actually happened. And I love this quote. Not this one, the next one. But David Bowd said, this is one of the most oft forgotten aspects of formative assessment, that just because you've given somebody the information doesn't mean that feedback has happened. And this is my favourite quote from Royce Sadler, that really what we're doing then, unless the student acts on it, it's dangling data substituting for effective feedback. So this really brought to my mind, how do I, as an academic, help students, because I can't do it for them, how can I help them to close that loop and act on the information that I'm giving them? And I think this is, I sort of thought I've got to approach this in a way that they feel motivated and they have the information that they need to act on that feedback. So what I did was I gathered the assessment data and I held an assessment analytics workshop the day after they received their feedback, or their information from me, I should call it, shouldn't I? And I gave them, to harvest the sort of information I needed about the impact that showing them this data was having on them. And I gave them a two-sided worksheet, and they had the same questions on both sides, but one was before and one was after seeing the data. And it really asked them questions about their motivation to act on their feedback and their sense of the importance of that feedback relative to each other, and it was all based on the criteria. And then just out of interest, at the end of the after slide, I just put a little box at the bottom and I just said, any surprises, question mark? Just to see what they had to say there. And then I followed it up with some focus groups where I had somebody talk to the students about the impact this had had on them. And this is some of the sorts of data that I showed them. Now this is pretty basic. This is probably what we all collect anyway, which is just simply showing the students, I'm sorry it's not got X and Y axis tags on it. My research assistant did this for me and forgot to do that, so I'm sorry, I need to add those on. But basically that is just a graph showing the students along the bottom on the x-axis, and then their level of achievement and their grade on the y-axis. And I remind you, this is the UK, so having a mark of above 80 is eye-watering. It's kind of, nosebleed section to have marks up there. So basically we've got the lowest achieving students there in the bottom left, and then moving up to the highest achieving students in the bottom right. And it dawned on me that not many students actually saw this information very often. It kind of struck me that I think a lot of the students who were getting a 2-1 or a distinction actually thought they were probably at the top of the pile and doing pretty well. But actually you can see here that the beginning of the 2-1 section kicks in at about the 50% mark. And I think just thought, showing them where they sit. But this is where, this is the same information, it's the same bunch of students. But what I've done here is I've overlaid another data set. Now, I wrote 3 quick marks, which were to do with the quality of their introduction. And this was an area that I had decided to focus on in their writing for this assessment task. And I wrote 3 quick marks. One said, this is an excellent introduction because it contains all of these qualities that we would expect in a good introduction. Then I wrote another quick mark that says this is a weak introduction because it's missing at least one of these key qualities that we would expect to see in a good introduction. And I'd then write in this extra box which part they were missing. And then I had a third quick mark that said there is no introduction here at all, you've just launched straight into your essay. And I basically traffic lighted them then against how that student performed overall in the assessment task on this graph. So you can see the students who had a strong introduction mark against their essay are green, the people who had a weak introduction are orange, and the people who had a missing introduction was red. Now I expected it to just go green, orange, red, but it didn't. It was much, much more complex than that. And here comes Pat Hill's influence on me. This is a much, much more complex problem to solve than just a good introduction means a good mark. But every single one of these bars then is a student who was sitting in that room and they could see where they sat on this graph. And what it allowed us to do is it opened up a very, very interesting conversation about the relationships between introductions and arguments and good quality essays. So we were able to see that yes, to get a really high eye-watering mark, you really needed to have a good introduction. But you can see there's some orange interlopers up in that top corner. So you could still get a good mark and produce a good piece of work, even with a weak introduction. But imagine how well they would have done if they had a good introduction to really set the argument going. And then there's this really random red column right here on the far right-hand side. That red column came running up to me after class and said, I'm the red column, I now know what I need to do. She was wetting herself, she was so excited. And so, I was able to say, look, there's some interesting plateaus here. But then look right to the left-hand side. You can still write a good introduction, but not follow through and therefore not get a good mark. But there is a definite trend from green towards orange as you move across this scale. So it wasn't so much that I was just showing them the information. It's more that it opened up a conversation that we were able to have about that relationship. This is the result of one of the questions that I asked them was how likely are you to use your feedback on your next assignment? And I was really surprised to see just how far that swing had gone around from the before to the after, particularly the growth in the very likelys from 32% to 64%, sort of doubling of a motivation to act on the feedback. And I was really surprised by that. And I looked at all of these questions, and this is a kind of weird graph to understand, but basically what this shows is anything towards the positive side of this graph, so the left-hand side of this graph, was students feeling more motivated to act on feedback under particular criteria, and the right-hand side is less motivated to act. So there's a definite trend that showing them this information motivated them to act on their feedback in a way that they hadn't already felt. But I wanted to, again, this is where the Mac thing, sorry, the whiteboard writing has fallen off the bottom. These are some of the key themes that emerged out of the qualitative analysis I did. It gave them a clearer sense of where they sat. I'm not happy with a 62 when 50% of people got over a 60. Just recognising that actually that might not be as high up the pecking order as they thought. And the bottom one, I was surprised at how many people fail from and get bad marks through punctuation. I do this, so I don't feel as bad to know others do it, but it makes me want to do better than them and fix my failing. So that sense of knowing that the errors you make are common errors, but they're important, was an interesting motivation. And this is one of my favourite quotes, because I felt like I needed to do better no matter where I had done. There were people above me, therefore I needed to be better. It's like horses, they see each other, they have to be the one in front. This was a big one for me, was shifting attention to areas they tend to neglect. I think it's the second one here. How badly wrong punctuation can make a difference to your overall mark. That 10% can be the difference between one grade boundary and the other. And I hadn't realised how overly long or grammatically confusing sentences would affect the overall mark. It's like, wakey, wakey. Some of the other, there's a bottom quote here that I think is interesting. I think he sort of ignored the feedback in a way. I know it sounds bad, but because on my essay for a previous module, I had a comma splice written on it. I didn't actually know what it meant, and so I just thought, I'll just leave that. But taking the time to say, 86% of you had this comment on your essay, this is what the problem is, actually sort of alerted them to it as something they probably needed to do some work on. I was really pleased to see it even motivated high-achieving students. So even with full marks, I feel I need to work on structure. You know, there's a sense that she or he still had something to work on. But also seeing a bigger picture. How many people make the same mistakes and how all the highest marks didn't involve any of these mistakes? And I'm surprised a lot of people didn't do a good introduction, even though we had done work leading into the assessment task on writing a good introduction. That came as an interesting surprise. Now, but this was where I was brought up short. This is where I thought, ouch, this is not as easy and as simple as just showing students information. This is powerful stuff, and students need scaffolding and support in the engagement with this data. Remember I said any surprises? This was one of the answers. I am absolutely stupid. And that just really brought me up short, and I thought, this is not as emotionally neutral as I thought it was. Another student said, yes, quite a lot has been challenging. And I worked so hard and still got a 2-2, gutted. I also thought my introduction was good and it was terrible. So just remembering, all learning comes with emotion. And everything you can learn how to do comes with emotion. And the emotion that comes with learning analytics and assessment analytics can be powerful. And this came from one of the focus groups. I think it was useful to go through the rubric again after we submitted the assignment, but I do think it was awkward having everybody's marks on the screen. Now, I didn't at any point show any student connected to a mark, but all of the variance of marks was available. Imagine if you got a fail and you had to put that you were in the 1% bottom. If I'd been the person that got the lowest mark, I wouldn't want to come to classes anymore. I'd feel devastated. And so that was actually a high achieving student feeling sorry for a low achieving student, so that was interesting. But again, this emotionally sensitive stuff really was not completely shared. One student said, no surprises at all. Yep. And this was a much more thoughtful response from one of the focus groups. University is a tough experience, and we're always going to feel uncomfortable doing things because there's going to be certain things that we have to do that are going to be way, way out of our comfort zone. And making sure that this sort of feeling is done in a controlled environment with people who can turn it into something constructive is the best way to do it if it has to be done. And I think it does have to be done. The way the tutor did it, she turned it into something that's constructive, that we can use in the future. We can see where we are and we can see where everybody else is and we can see what we need to do to get better. And doesn't that warm the very cockles of your heart? And that quotation, I go back to it sometimes to just remind myself of why I'm doing this and why I think it's important to show students and share this information with students. And this was the bit that really got to me. A student came up to me after one of these workshops and said, why hasn't anybody ever said this to me before? And I had to bite my lip from saying, you've been told 1,000 times. But what this really highlighted for me was that showing the students this information in this way was having an impact in a way that was different to just pointing it out as errors or comments on their work previously. And that was showing them a bigger picture, was allowing them to see and therefore feel motivated to act, and remember, closing the feedback loop in a way that hadn't happened before. So that's kind of where I got to with my own work as an individual. I left the University of Huddersfield at the end of 2013 and moved to the University of New South Wales at the beginning of 2014 and haven't taught a student since because I'm an Associate Dean of Education, therefore I don't teach. Go figure. So what I've been doing since I've been at UNSW in the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences is developing the electronic assessment management strategies, and so that we're managing assessment less as paper-based and more as electronic for lots of efficiency and data security reasons, but also because the students much prefer not having to hand anything in on paper. It's the 4 C's of convenience, confidence, clarity, and confidentiality, if you're interested in why they like it. But as a result of that, I've now got quite a lot of academic colleagues marking electronically and doing so very, very happily indeed. Even the ones that told me it would give them arthritis, I've actually emailed me and said, I'm sorry, Cath, I was mean to you. I was wrong. I love it. It's making my life so much easier. Thank you. So I have got a lot of academic staff now marking electronically. So the question now is, what now? What can we do with this information? And how might we use analytics to turn this information into action? And to my mind, the key here is interventions. And that's why the topic of my talk is a cheeky change on the conference theme, which is critical interventions. How might we intervene with support that is tailored, that is personalised, to support students at their point of need with what they need to be able to act? And I've been particularly inspired, and I know you're not going to be able to read this, so I'll pull out the bit that's important. I've been particularly inspired by research that's being done by colleagues at the University of New South Wales and at the University of Sydney on the LATIX workflow. LATIX, I can't quite remember what it all stands for, but it's Learning Analytics Teaching User Experience. I think that's what it stands for. But they've developed a really useful workflow to help guide people in the process of developing learning analytics strategies. And the key thing to point out is this top left-hand corner that's called problem identification. And what it does, it encourages us, as we approach a learning analytics strategy, to sit and have conversations with each other and ask ourselves critical questions before we start building any dashboards, before we start trialling any data sets or harvesting methods, to sit and actually say, well, what do we want to do here? And these questions, I think, are really important. What are the requirements? And this is my favourite. What are the unexplored possibilities? What are the things we've never done before because we've never been able to do them before because we've never had the information to hand, but now we do? What are the unexplored possibilities? And to my mind, this kind of assessment analytics is a big unexplored possibility. Who are the stakeholders? What are the available data sources? How can the data be captured? And one of the big things that we're discovering is just because the data is being stored doesn't mean that it can be easily harvested. And one of the messages we need to get across to the people who are developing these e-marking tools is to get that data more easily into our hands. It's our data, we own it, we should be able to get our hands on it. Turnitin, are you listening? How can the data be captured? What is the learning context? And this is one of the areas where I think people working in student support services and student learning development and academic staff can be working much more closely together. What are the learning tools? What is the intended pedagogy? And how are we going to evaluate the impact of learning analytics? And basically what I'm doing at the moment is working with academic colleagues and with colleagues from the library, the Learning Centre, the International Office, from the Medical Centre, all sorts of other things to say, how can we get together and have conversations about what we want to do? So I'm encouraging teaching teams to galvanise themselves together into a team to work together to make decisions about how they might approach assessment analytics. But I'm really keen, and I'm loosely calling them student support services or resources in the middle, the library, the Learning Centre. How might we work with those colleagues to make sure that we're developing strategies that we design into our learning analytics strategies for good results? And here I'm inspired by the work of David Bowd, and he talks about this feedback loop, and I'm returning to his work before, and this is his feedback loop Mark 1, where a student does an activity, we then in our feedback give information back to the student and expect them to then feed that back into their next activity and so forth. This is a pretty standard way about how feedback loops work at the moment. And he actually says, well, we should be thinking in a sort of feedback loop Mark 2, where we think about how the information we give to students in cohort 1, so in, say, semester 1, 2014, might feed through to students in that same class in the following year. So how might we take the information that's given to the teacher on the effect of their information that they've given to students? How might that feed back into the next cohort of students? So, for instance, we might harvest information from our marking and then say to the next group next year, this is where last year's group struggled the most. So let's focus on that this year to make sure that that's an area that you don't struggle in as much. Now, I've been inspired by his work to develop what I'm calling feedback loop Mark 3, which is actually thinking not just waiting for one cohort to go through before that can be of value, but also thinking about how this information might translate from one course to another. So we might take the information of a student's behaviour in an assessment task in course 1 and feed it through to a tutor who's working with that same student on another course, for them to be able to know this student has already been given this information about their assessment, let's see if they've acted on it. And actually feeding that into some kind of data warehouse, perhaps some kind of dashboard that allows us to share the information and therefore build in genuine consequences and rewards for students to act on their feedback. And you'll notice that I've also put learning support services in there as well, that we should be sharing this information with the library, we should be sharing the information with the Learning Centre, with the International Office, so that we can actually be working together to design interventions that help students act on the information that they've been given. And here are some ways that we might be able to do this. And this is the one that I'm really wanting to explore next year, and I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts on it. It's kind of what I'm calling a learning support sieve. What I'm really keen to do is be able to work from one-to-one interventions where individual students go to the Learning Centre for help on an aspect of their writing, but we're able to gather together the, say, 6 or 12 or even 24 students who are all needing the same support on the same problem, and therefore be able to have one-to-many interventions. And this is a way that we might do it. Now, I'm using punctuation as an example here just because it's something that we all understand, but I don't want to suggest that it's limited to things like punctuation. It's just an easy demonstration. But this is data that I harvested from a group of first-year students. It was their first writing task. Many of them were returning to education as mature students after a long break. I'm not going to explain why the word Sarah is there. It's just she was my colleague and her quick mark sets sort of emerged into my data. But basically this divides up the students on the left-hand side, so there's 23 students. Again, it was an eye-wateringly difficult class for me to manage, but I coped. 23 students. And it's just counted how many quick marks they got on this relatively short piece of writing. I think it was about 800 words. And we can see here that student 13 has quite a lot more quick marks on the paper than student 1. And I thought this would have been, I didn't show the students this, but it would have been very interesting to show the students this. Remember, these are mature age students coming back to higher education after a long break from study. It could have been that student 13 looked at her feedback or his feedback and thought, yeah, that's a reasonable kind of number of errors, that's to be expected. And student 1 might be thinking, oh my goodness, I've made a mistake, I'm going to fail, this is a catastrophe. But allowing students to sort of calibrate their sense of what, you know, how they're performing in terms of the number of mistakes or problems in their writing. But you'll notice that the purple here is punctuation, and that's the bulk of the colour here. So we can dig actually into that a little bit more, and we can now see that student 13 and student 15 both have a similar number of problems in terms of punctuation. In fact, student 13 is not putting commas where there should be, and student 15 is putting commas where there shouldn't be, I think. But wouldn't it be interesting to get those two together, to work together with a learning support tutor to help them figure out what the problem with commas is, to get a bit of peer learning into it. The point is that the students who have green next to their name there need to be invited to the possessive apostrophe workshop. Anybody want to run that one? No? Okay. No volunteers? But if you don't have green next to your name, let's not bother them. Let's not take up precious class time teaching people who already know how to use a possessive apostrophe to use a possessive apostrophe. So a learning support tutor, a language support tutor could work with the academic staff member in designing the assessment task and decide, okay, the priority for this assessment task for this course is going to be punctuation. That's what we're going to focus on. And so the information that goes to the students about their behaviour could also go to the Learning Centre, who could then plan a perfectly timed, just-in-time workshop that invites students to come based on the problems that they have identified to the tutor and the Learning Centre in their writing. And that information, whether they've attended or not, could go back to the tutor, and the tutor could then, at their next marking moment, say, yes, there is improvement here, yes, this student has gone to the workshop, yes, I can congratulate this student and reward them for acting on the information that I've given them, or the problem is still there, the student has not gone to the workshop, I can have genuine consequences by saying, I've pointed this out to you before, the error remains, you would give it an opportunity. Or a student could still be showing the error, have gone to the workshop, but obviously needs more support, more attention. And again, it's not just about punctuation. Flipping the other way. It doesn't have to be a face-to-face workshop. The Learning Support Centre, the Learning Centre, the library could work with the academic staff, remember they're galvanised as a team, to put together a set of self-paced online resources that the students are then fed through to by the quick marks that are put on their work. But it's not just about punctuation. We could do something about paragraph structure, or something on analysis versus description, or we could work with the library and do some analysis of bibliographies to identify or diagnose particular patterns or problems. Do you remember back in the day when the students only had books in their bibliography and they didn't have journal articles, and now it's gone the other way around, which is interesting. So it's not just about, it could be about any of these things. The point is that we could be working with this information together collectively. And to my mind, the key benefits of these interventions for the students are, first of all, that they are targeted and personalised. They are what that particular student has shown us that they need at the point of need. And they are what's called in the learning analytics terminology a just-in-time intervention. The other thing is it allows us to harness the power of peer learning. We might have a student from chemistry sitting next to a student in philosophy who are both demonstrating the same problem, and understanding it might be the difference between analysis and description. And by being able to explain to each other how that applies in their own disciplinary context might turn the light bulb on. But it also allows us to lay down genuine rewards and consequences for students acting on the information we're giving them, and thereby closing the feedback loop. Now, this is where I do a little segue into what I am also particularly interested in, which is to do with contract cheating. And this is another area, and I think that that particular 3-minute segment from the video is, I think, another important reminder of why we all need to be working closely together with things. So just a very quick, this is sort of 3-minute summary of my paper from last week, and hopefully it will be available on the conference website, Ruth's nodding, when I get myself organised to give them the slides, to have a look at that as well. But basically, is anybody familiar with contract cheating? Understand what it is? Yeah, sort of? Okay, basically I prefer the term contract cheating to these other euphemisms like essay mills, bespoke essays, or ghostwriting, because to my mind contract cheating does what it says, or says what it does, which is that students are contracting other people to do their work for them, and it is cheating. And I think these other terms are a kind of euphemism. And it's an area of growing concern. Anybody familiar with the My Master situation? Anybody personally involved with that here? It's mostly New South Wales universities were affected. I looked to my colleagues at the University of Newcastle, colleagues from Macquarie, Sydney, and obviously UNSW and Wollongong were all affected. But can I just say that looks to be the tip of the iceberg. But basically contract cheating is both paid and unpaid. It's students using both cash and bartering, but also unpaid things like favours, including sexual favours. I had a student look me in the eye and say I did all of my ex-boyfriend's essays last year in a way that made it clear that she thought he clearly wasn't worth it, rather than concerned about the academic integrity issues. But there are also sense of mutual obligation, parents doing work for their children at school, for instance, when they're critically ill. Those kinds of things are quite common. And I've been looking at some procurements for contract cheating sites. I'm just getting ethics clearance to do research on them now, but I'm just monitoring the pings at the moment. And since I started doing this, and they date back to about March this year, I've had procurements come from school level, an 8th grader, right through to PhD dissertations. So it's every single level. Basically what's happened is we've now moved on from the sort of cut and paste copying that was common, because Turnitin's pretty much picking that up now. And the stock essay purchase sites where students were selling their essays, and then the essay sites were selling them on to other students to use as whole, because again, Turnitin picks those up once they're used more than once. To the point now where it's custom written essay sites. So these are people who are writing work specifically for students. And in recent years, the price has plummeted. A lot of them are advertising now for $7.50 a page. Essay Shark and Edison both advertise for about $7.50 a page. Obviously the price goes up the closer the request is made to the deadline, but a lot of students are getting very organised. They're not time poor. They're getting organised, and they're ordering these very early on, so that they're relatively cheap. And the volume of it is what really knocks me sideways. As I said, I've been looking at some procurement sites. I'm up to 57,000 now since about March, but Essay Shark has just clicked over 47,008,000 orders. And that's gone up from 21 million in September last year. The volume of this is astonishing. This is a global industry. It's a worldwide problem. This is at all sectors of education. The $7.50 a page indicates the price point has dropped considerably. The vast majority of people working in this industry 5 years ago were working in USA, Canada, New Zealand, Australia. Now, most of the people working in this industry are working in Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, the Philippines, and Kenya are the kind of dominant areas. So the price point has plummeted, which has basically priced a lot of people out of the market. But the key message I want to come to you with, so it's a very short, and I'll try and see if I can segue these two things together. I think it's very, very easy for us to say this is a student problem. It is their responsibility. They are lazy. They are cheats. But that little section from the video, I think, really brings it home that we have some responsibility in this as well. That there is a problem that students are facing when they are trying to do some of the assessment and some of the sort of ways that we operate as institutions that is encouraging them and even motivating them to cheat in this way. I'm not saying they are absolved from responsibility, but we must share the responsibility and think, what can we do? And this is very interesting research that's just come out. I commend it to you, looking at contract cheating in the market in essays. I mean, primarily what it shows us, this research, is that there is a huge amount of oversupply in the market. So if a student wants an essay on whatever done in 8 hours, they will get it done in 8 hours because there are so many people who are looking for that work, and they go for the more lucrative work, which has the shorter turnaround. And so that's the key point of this paper. But the other thing this paper shows us is that the people who are more likely to use this kind of cheating are people who are either struggling with the material or struggling with the language. And obviously there's a Venn diagram issue here. If students are struggling with both, they're even more vulnerable. Ed Dante, who was the shadow scholar, said that he's seen the word desperate misspelled so many times you cannot imagine. But the students who are going to this, I suspect, I have a hypothesis that they are students who have come and have tried to pass and have failed to pass. And they get to a point where they give up and find this easier way out. Now, I'm not for a moment suggesting this is a problem limited to international students. It is not. I can say that quite categorically. But I hope this diagram shows you that they are more vulnerable and perhaps more susceptible to temptation, and also might be more vulnerable in terms of how we go about our assessment procedures and our assessment design. I think there is a widespread perception, again, that students are doing this to get a better mark, to get an HD rather than a D. That is simply not the case. The students who are doing this are getting work that is good enough, not good, to pass. And I think that this is a really important reminder to us about how we might actually be able to use assessment analytics as a kind of early warning system. When the students have come to us who are struggling with the content, or they're struggling with the language, or they're struggling with both, that we might be able to lay down some data trails that people like the International Office or the Learning Centre might be able to have access to, that means that we can have just-in-time interventions, perhaps English language acquisition support, that is coming at the point at need before they succumb to the temptation of going into this kind of contract cheating. So I think what I'm trying to show here is that there is a bigger picture at work than just being able to pick out possessive apostrophes and semicolons and paragraph structure, that there might be something much more about intervening at the right time, at the critical time, that critical intervention where students can actually be supported to engage in a kind of learning approach that might rescue them, save them from the consequences that come from the temptation to cheat. And I'll remind you, of course, that the legacy issue of this is also really important, that if students have cheated their way through school, they have no option but to cheat their way through university, and of course then the public risk kicks in. I have seen procurements about a lot of nursing ones, anaesthetist stuff, there's stuff to do with engineering. There's a very famous one that Clark and Lancaster found about nuclear power plant safety engineering. I'm yet to find one on aviation, but when I do, I'll be very excited. But then I think there's a lot on financial planning. There's a lot on HR management. And I think, there's a public risk element here as well. And I think that that's something that we need to be working together. And I think, as I said, it takes a village for us to do this. And assessment analytics and data sharing may be a way, if you can meet us where we're kind of heading to with the e-marking, we might be able to work together to really create some fantastic interventions for our students that are really coming at the critical time and the critical point of need. All's quiet.
Provide academic skills, but I think that those students are just, if they can't get into an English speaking university and get their degree, they're disadvantaged for their whole life. So they're desperate to do that. But I don't know how we can solve the problem, because their English isn't really good enough, and they do struggle because of that. I'm not aware of any students I already speak, you know, not going to happen, but they're always going to be behind the eight ball. I don't know, I just feel so frustrated that this inequity exists around the globe, that English-speaking people are always going to have an advantage over people who are English second or third language.
Yeah, and a lot of those English-speaking people are monolingual as well, so there's a sort of power in ignorance, which is interesting as well. But I think you're absolutely right. But the thing that I put back to that is we actually just don't know. And we don't know the relationship between, say, an IELTS score and student success or student struggle. And this might be a way of actually capturing that information and understanding it. The International Office are particularly interested in working with me on this to see if there's any correlation between students who are struggling because of their English language and agents, particular agents that they're going through, or particular prior qualifications, or particular, what do we call them, articulation agreements, or something like that. So at this stage, the work that I might be doing with them is probably going to be diagnostic, but it's a start, and I think that that's part of where students actually, where the rubber hits the road for those students is in their assessment. And so why aren't we actually looking at I call it behaviour in assessment, it's a bit of a clunky word, but why aren't we looking at their behaviour in assessment and using the eyes and the minds of all of the tutors who are marking their work to help us gather the information we need to get a sense of how big that problem is, what it looks like, and therefore inform what we might do, how we might intervene and make better decisions into the future. So I think you're absolutely right. And it is frustrating. It's incredibly frustrating. It's frustrating for us. It's frustrating for them. It's frustrating for their parents who are having to foot the bill if they fail. So yeah, but can you see how this might be a way of getting started on getting some information? Yeah. Hello up there. Hi.
Thank you very much for both points that you have raised. The first one, when you talked about the marks and the feedback and the feed forward, which I think is an excellent way of giving students some a forum where they can actually find out and learn. But unfortunately, not many students have even bothered to look at the feedback, and that's what we are told by the tutors.
Yep.
And also when the workshops are run after the feedback, after the first assignment, even the lecture, students aren't thinking about the previous assessment, they are already moving on. So that can be a bit of a problem, both for the academics as well as for the learning skills people.
Yeah, I share that frustration as well. I mean, I walked along a particular corridor in a university in a city near here that will remain unnameless, and there was a box of marked essays sitting outside that academic's office for the students to come and collect it. I made sure that disappeared pretty quickly, but that sat there, it could have sat there all summer and the students wouldn't have come to get it. And so I think that there is certain things that we need to have a think about. Is that the students' fault? Are they not coming to get it because they're lazy or they don't care? Or is it because the information that they're going to pick up, they know is no use to them, they can't read it because it's in some kind of illegible scrawl, or it's come too late, or they've already gone home and they're in Ballarat by now and coming in to collect it isn't an option. One of the interesting things I did when I moved to e-marking was, I remember at one point the feedback was due to go back to the middle at 1 o'clock, and I'd finished it 15 minutes early, go me, But I emailed the student and said, I've just released it 15 minutes early. So I pinged them an email and said, it's just been released 15 minutes early. And I checked at about 1:15 the hour, and by that stage, 60% of the students had already logged on and got their feedback. And in the focus group research I did as part of the eBeam project, that was a JISC-funded project I did in the UK, the students said to me, if the feedback comes back on paper, it goes into a drawer. But if it comes back electronically, it's open as a separate tab on my computer as I'm writing my next piece of work. And I'm toggling between what the previous feedback was and what I need to do next time. And everybody around the focus group just went, that's how we do it, that's standard. And I was like, forms the very cockles of your heart again when you hear that kind of stuff. So I think there's a certain element of a perception that from academic tutors and staff that students aren't interested in their feedback. I think they're probably less interested in it when it comes to them at particular times and particular formats. But I also think that there might be more motivation to come to workshops on feedback if they know there are going to be consequences if they don't act on it. And that's the closing the feedback loop. If at the moment they just get the same error pointed out to them again, then why would you do something about it? But if you know you're going to lose 2 marks for every time an error that's been previously pointed out to you appears again, then maybe that ante might be upped a bit. So again, I'm just sort of thinking, I completely I hear that a lot myself, but I also have experienced students telling me that when feedback comes back to them in different ways and when feedback is explained to them in that bigger picture, then the motivation kicks in. I'm not saying it's uniform, I'm not saying it's perfect, but I think it's better than jots and tittles, as one of the scholars says, on a piece of paper, in a box, outside an office at Christmas.
Thank you. I also had one more point, that is about your second middle presentation that you gave, because that relates to something that I'll be presenting to, and that is the point about students, academic writing, or is it English proficiency? And what I have seen with my work with students and the assignments is that many times it is the expectation of academic writing which is there. They have met it, they have shown their evaluation, but it's the lack of English proficiency which is obstructing that, and people can't read it, the markers can't read it.
Yep.
So the point I want to raise is there any way that we can maybe change the way how assessments are written, expected, because otherwise students are, or the teachers are always going to be one step ahead of us.
Yeah.
That's what we can see happening.
I'm not quite sure if this is what you're asking, but you might be asking me, correct me if I'm wrong, can we design this out with our assessment design? Can we design contract cheating out of our assessment design? I'm afraid, and I kind of anticipated you might ask me this, is what can we do? Can we design it out? No, we can't. We simply can't, because what can be bought is anything. These are just a sample of the things that I've seen procured. And essays, essay drafts, essay plans, PhD and master's dissertations, research proposals, dissertation plans, dissertation chapters, and responding to supervisors' feedback. That was a good one. Deep breath. Here are a few more. This is a tiny subset of what I've seen people procure. You can't design it out. It's just, if you can assess it, you can buy it, basically. And I would actually also respond to that further by saying not only can we not design it out, we should not design it out. Because, as Tricia Bertram-Gallant says, it's not actually helping students develop their ethical fitness and their self-regulatory skills to resist the urge to cheat. She says we only want to graduate students who don't cheat even when given the opportunity to do so. So if we take away every opportunity that they have to cheat, then we spit them out into the graduate employment market without that skill developed. And one of the other frightening things that Clark and Lancaster have found is students now using, or not students, I beg your pardon, employees now using things like Freelancer and Getacoder to build databases and data sets and database user interfaces and sending in live data from an oncology ward in a California hospital to a Freelancer site. So that's the legacy issue, that if a student cheats their way through university, they have to cheat their way through work, and the public risk element of that is terrifying. So my quick answer to your question is, should we design it out? Can we design it out? No and no.
I just wanted to say thank you very much for this interesting talk, and also I'm not sure which person mentioned about explanations. I mean, I know that you have
Yeah,
the
yeah.
4 skills. And we spent time on explaining to the students what was happening. So I think the explanations really helped because the students saw that they might get a mark like 3, but they knew that they were heading for 5 and then 7.5. And we began to see a pattern of how fast that could be done on average as well. But the exciting thing for me was when I visited them 2 years later on speech day, and people were running up to me to say, I got 4.5. I know I'm on the way.
Yeah.
And I was excited because I knew it was true, but also because they knew what was happening. And they were also doing content-based exams as well. So I don't know how that can be implemented in a university situation, but
Yeah, I mean, one thing
it was a very positive experience.
Yeah, and that sounds fantastic. And one of the things I would just pick out from what you've just said, which I think is really critical to some of the work that we're doing at the moment at UNSW, is one of the other great things about collecting this data is actually being able to see patterns and showing patterns to students and showing patterns to ourselves that you might not see if you're just looking at things individually. And so being able to visualise the data in ways that allows us to tell stories to ourselves and better understand things to ourselves is really critical. And it does bring those breakthroughs through. So thanks for sharing that.